Hello there, and welcome to All About Earth, where science slows down and wonder stretches its legs. Wherever you are right now, maybe wrapped in a warm blanket, maybe half asleep on the couch, or perhaps lying beneath the open sky, I'm glad you're here. Take a breath, soft and steady. Let your thoughts drift somewhere ancient. Not just old, but primeval, back before forests or dragonflies, back when continents were only sketches, and almost all life was waterborne. Now picture a creature not much longer than your hand, a modern lungfish. Its body glints with bronze and mud. The tide pool it calls home is shrinking under a stubborn sun. Slowly, awkwardly, it drags itself across damp earth, fins pressing into the muds, not trying to conquer land, not dreaming of evolution or destiny. It's just looking for another puddle, another breath, another chance. It's an odd sight, half fish, half something else, and in that shuffling movement lies one of life's great turning points. Not a triumphant march of progress, but a stumble, a beautiful, muddy accident. That's the thought I'd like you to hold for a while tonight. Why did our distant ancestors ever leave the water? Was it curiosity, necessity, or simply the blind roll of evolutionary dice? About 35 million years ago, during what scientists later named the Devonian Period, a few aquatic creatures began venturing into shallow swamps and silty shores. Not because they planned to live there. Evolution doesn't plan, but because circumstances nudged them. Maybe droughts stranded them in evaporating pools. Maybe they chased prey that flopped too far up the bank. Step by slippery step, fins found firmer purchase. Lungs, once an emergency backup, became something more. From these small, desperate movements came everything that would someday walk, run, or dance across land. Reptiles, birds, mammals, and yes, us. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, it's enough to picture that ancient lungfish sliding over wet earth, unaware that it's rewriting the story of life. Its awkward crawl isn't a plan, it's persistence. The quiet stubbornness shared by every living thing that's ever refused to stop breathing. So as you listen, wherever you're resting, imagine the stillness of that ancient shoreline. The air heavy with humidity, the mud warm beneath fins that don't yet know they'll become legs. Imagine that moment when chance met opportunity and an accident became inheritance. And while we drift deeper into this story, feel free to leave a comment, tap like, or subscribe if you'd like to help this quiet corner of science reach other curious minds. Think of it as sending a ripple across a pond, gentle, widening, alive. Now, settle in. The tide's going out, and the first steps toward land are just beginning. 75 million years ago, the Earth was a restless experiment. The world as we know it was still learning its shapes, its rivers, its coasts, its forests, its breath. The continents were gathered differently then, huddled closer together, a patchwork of shallow seas and green-tinted shorelines, under a sun that felt warmer, sharper, younger. Much of the planet's surface was ocean. Yet everywhere the water met the land, new stories were beginning. Quiet, chemical, patient. The Devonian, sometimes called the Age of Fishes, was an age of confidence. The seas teemed with life so abundant that if you could have floated in one of those ancient lagoons, you would have felt the pulse of evolution beneath you. Trilobites scuttled over the seafloor, their armored bodies glittering like living jewels. Coral reefs spread across the continental shelves, building elaborate cathedrals of calcium that sheltered countless creatures. Among them moved sleek, muscular fish, some plated in bone, some agile and swift, each adapted to its own patch of water. The oceans had become the planet's great workshop, full of movement and invention. Above the waves, though, the world was quieter, still raw, still waiting. The continents, bare and wind-scoured, had only recently begun to dress themselves in green. Along the edges of deltas and the margins of tidal channels, plants had started to stake their claim. They were small, simple beings by modern standards, delicate stems branching like green coral, capped with tiny sporangia instead of leaves. Cooksonia was one of the earliest, thin, reed-like, rarely taller than a few inches, yet audacious in its simplicity. Its presence marked a turning point, the moment life began to breathe not only in water, but in air. Imagine a landscape dotted with these early pioneers. Vast stretches of mudflats gleam under a low sun. The tide creeps in and out, leaving behind shallow pools where silver flashes of fish fins betray the presence of life. The air smells faintly of minerals and salt. There are no trees, no birds, no insects buzzing, only the wind and the slow whisper of water retreating. It is a silence so profound that the smallest ripple feels like an event. And yet, for all its quiet, this world is electric with potential. The soil, if we can even call it that, is a thin crust of dust and decaying microbes, rich with untapped minerals. Beneath it lies iron, phosphorus, and the chemical scaffolding that future forests will one day use to build themselves. The rivers are broad and braided, fanning across the land in glittering threads. They twist and meander, depositing sand and silt in endless patterns. When the rains come, and they come hard, the channels overflow, feeding a labyrinth of floodplains and lagoons where life experiments with form and strategy. The air itself is changing. Oxygen levels, for the first time, are rising towards something close to what we know today. Photosynthetic algae in the oceans and plants along the shorelines are exhaling more of it, filling the atmosphere with the breath of life. It's an invisible transformation, but one that alters everything. The skies, once dim and reddish, now glow a deeper blue. Lightning dances more easily across the humid horizon, igniting storms that sweep across the land. The earth is learning to breathe, and the results are dramatic. For the creatures of the sea, this new atmosphere means opportunity, but also danger. Water and air are different kingdoms, governed by different physics. In the ocean, gills pull oxygen directly from the water, where it dissolves in tiny amounts. On land, oxygen is everywhere, but the medium is dry, the density low, the demands entirely different. To step beyond the water's edge is to leave behind buoyancy, to feel the full pull of gravity. For the first time, it is to confront the weight of one's own body, the dryness of air on skin, the unfamiliar drag of mud instead of the easy resistance of current. Still, something in the environment keeps issuing an invitation. The tide withdraws, the puddles shrink, and the shorelines shimmer with promise and peril. Perhaps the sea itself whispers, "Come see what's above." The Devonian climate is warm, tropical in many regions, but not uniformly gentle. Vast monsoons sweep across the continents, carrying moisture inland. When they break, they leave behind wetlands that stretch for miles, shallow swamps fed by tidal backwaters, rich in nutrients, alive with insects that hum in low, clumsy flight. The first winged creatures have not yet taken to the air, but arthropods already roam the damp surfaces. Millipedes longer than a human hand curl through the leafless stems of early plants. Scorpions prowl the mud, armored and cautious. The land, once barren, is now breathing softly, hesitantly, like a sleeper waking from a long dream. Under the still water, the sediment is thick with the remains of algae, shells, and tiny organisms. Each flood stirs up this living soup, turning it into a haze of suspended life. Where the rivers empty into shallow seas, deltas bloom, not with flowers but with productivity. Here the mix of salt and fresh water creates an in-between world, unpredictable and fertile. It's a place where new species are born, tested, and either lost or carried forward. The early plants along these coasts are changing too. Some have begun to grow taller, building internal tubes, primitive vascular systems to carry water upward. With that innovation comes a new kind of strength. Where once only mats of moss-like organisms hugged the ground, now small forests of Rhynia and Zostrophilium rise a few feet high, their stems branching toward the light. They're still fragile, easily toppled by wind or rain, but they mark the first architecture of the living world. As these plants spread, they begin to change the land itself. Their roots, thin and tentative, start to trap sediment, holding soil in place. The runoff slows, nutrients build up. Over time, this quiet collaboration between plant and planet transforms entire landscapes. What was once rock and dust becomes fertile ground. Rivers carve more stable channels. Floodplains evolve into swampy basins, rich in organic matter. The earth is practicing for the forests to come. In the shallows nearby, fish dart through a kaleidoscope of life. Some wear bony plates, like armor, others shimmer with smooth scales. The water is crowded, so much competition that every niche becomes a frontier. Predators prowl the reefs, their jaws lined with teeth newly evolved for gripping, tearing and crushing. Jawed fish are one of the Devonians' great inventions, and with them comes the modern logic of the food web, the dance of hunter and prey that still defines life today. If you could sink beneath the surface of one of these Devonian seas, you'd enter a realm of movement and colour. Light filters down in golden beams through greenish water. Silhouettes of armoured fish glide past coral spire. At the seafloor, trilobites forage, their segmented legs stirring up silt as they search for scraps. Nearby, sponges sway gently in the current, filtering plankton. Strange eel-like creatures twist through the shadows. Every inch of space, every drop of water, is alive. But beyond the reefs, near the edges of rivers and lagoons, life begins to press against its boundaries. The water grows shallow, warm, unstable. Algae bloom in sudden bursts, turning the surface into a green mirror. When droughts arrive, and they often do, the water evaporates quickly, leaving behind only puddles and damp earth. For those who live there, survival means adaptation. The world is forcing innovation not by design, but by accident. And above all this, the air hums with oxygen more than ever before. It's a paradox. Abundance in the sky, scarcity in the mud. The lungs of the world are opening, but not everything is ready to breathe. The boundary between water and land has never felt sharper, more dangerous, more full of promise. This was the Devonian earth, a mosaic of swamps, channels and deltas, stitched together by tides and storms, a place of shimmering shallows and green beginnings. The land was not yet comfortable, too harsh, too dry, too bright, but it was alive with potential. Every rainfall carved new paths for rivers. Every drought opened a new experiment in survival. It's easy from our vantage point to see this as destiny, as if life was always meant to move upward and outward, from sea to sky. But in the Devonian, nothing was inevitable. Each species was improvising, reacting to change, making do. The plants didn't grow to feed animals, the fish didn't breathe to become amphibians. The land wasn't waiting for conquest. It was simply there, open, raw, and full of invitations. If you stood on one of those ancient floodplains, you might see clouds of mist rising from the warm ground after a storm. You might hear the faint slap of water against rock, the sigh of wind through stems of Cooksonia. You'd feel the air heavy with humidity, thick with oxygen, ready for something new to happen. But you wouldn't yet see forests or birds or mammals. You'd see a planet rehearsing, trying out the chords that would someday become the symphony of life on land. In that sense, the Devonian wasn't just an age of fish, it was an age of thresholds. The water's edge wasn't a boundary, it was a meeting place where chemistry and chance conspired in mud and sunlight. Every ripple was an invitation, every shrinking pool a challenge, every breath a gamble. And somewhere, in one of those greenish swamps, a creature lifted its head above the surface, not to change the world, but simply to survive the afternoon. The sky above shimmered with light and oxygen. The land waited, patient and strange, and in that small, unremarkable moment, the earth exhaled and whispered the same invitation it has always whispered to the curious, the desperate, and the brave. Come ashore if you dare. If you listen closely enough, through the hum of the present, through the murmur of waves and wind, you might hear a faint echo from the deep past, a sound like fins brushing mud. It comes from an age when the line between sea and shore was not a border but a question. The creatures that asked it were neither fish nor amphibian, neither fully bound to water nor truly free of it. There was something in between, the tetrapodomorphs, the strange, brave, half-formed explorers of a new kind of world. These were not mythic beasts or evolutionary miracles. They were ordinary in their own time, as unremarkable to their surroundings as minnows in a stream. Yet in hindsight, they look almost prophetic. The missing verses between water and land, gills and breath, the moment evolution paused mid-sentence and rewrote itself. Imagine one of them, the famous Tiktaalik, drifting in the shallows of an ancient channel. Its body glints like hammered bronze beneath the sunlight that ripples through greenish water. It looks, at first glance, like a fish scales gleaming, tail strong and flattened, eyes watching for movement. But then you notice the details, a head that lifts slightly from the water, a neck that turns, a neck. Fish don't have those, and its fins, thick and muscular, end not in the delicate filaments of swimmers, but in sturdy bones arranged almost like a primitive hand. Inside that structure lies the blueprint of every future limb: humerus, radius, ulna, the architecture of walking, waiting patiently inside a fin. Tetrapodomorphs like Tiktaalik were the transitional wonders of their age. They were fish, yes, but they were fish with ambitions. Their fins were not just paddles for swimming, but supports for pushing along the bottom of shallow channels. Their eyes, once suited for scanning the dim depths, had crept upward to face the surface. Their ribs thickened, strong enough to hold up a body, even briefly, against gravity. Some even had primitive lungs alongside gills, a dual system, half borrowed from the sea, half borrowed from the air. It's hard not to see intention in that design, though we know it wasn't planned. Evolution is an improviser, not an architect. It works with what it has, one small adjustment at a time. Each change a whispered "why not?" A fin that helps push through dense vegetation also helps when oxygen runs low, and a creature needs to gulp air at the surface. A neck that aids in hunting at the waterline also becomes the first motion toward looking around on land. Nothing deliberate, just possibility stacking upon possibility until something new takes shape. The tetrapodomorphs were explorers in the most literal sense, not of geography but of anatomy. Their experiments happened inside their own bodies. Acanthostega, for instance, carried both lungs and gills. It still swam gracefully, tail undulating like a ribbon, but its limbs were unmistakably legs, jointed, with digits, though too weak to support it for long on land. It might have used them to anchor itself among underwater plants, or to crawl through submerged vegetation. It was amphibious in the truest, earliest sense, a creature straddling two realms without belonging fully to either. Ichthyostega, another early traveler between worlds, pushed that balance even further. Its limbs were stronger, its spine more robust, its ribs forming a cage that could bear weight for short journeys across mudflats. Its head was broader, its eyes set high, a design suited for peering above water, for scanning the horizon of a new element. It still breathed through gills when young, but as it matured, lungs took over. It could move with an awkward gait across damp ground, using its limbs like paddles more than legs. It wasn't walking, not yet, but it was trying, and that attempt would echo for millions of years. In these animals you can see evolution hesitating, not leaping forward, but balancing on the edge of change. They were not designed for land, but neither were they content with the sea. Their bodies tell a story of adaptation caught mid-breath. Bones once built for swimming now began to bear weight. Fins became tools for leverage. Lungs, once an emergency backup for stagnant water, grew reliable enough to sustain life in open air. The neck detached from the shoulder girdle, giving the head the freedom to turn and look. Imagine the sensation, the first glance, the first shift of perspective, a world seen not from below the surface, but through open air, under sunlight unfiltered by water. There's something profoundly poetic about that moment. The world above would have seemed enormous, harsh, dazzling. Air itself would have been a strange, invisible ocean, dry and full of new sounds. The first time one of these creatures raised its head fully out of the water, perhaps it blinked against the brightness and felt its body grow heavier, every muscle aware of the planet's pull. The lungs expanded, the heart worked differently, the senses adjusted. In that simple act, the act of lifting, breathing, seeing, the boundary between marine and terrestrial life blurred forever. We often think of evolution as progress, as if nature always meant to produce legs and lungs and spines strong enough for walking. But these creatures remind us that progress is a story we write after the fact. For Tiktaalik and its kin, there was no goal, no destination. The traits that we now call transitional were just solutions to the problems of the moment. How to move, how to hunt, how to survive when water grew shallow or unpredictable. Evolution isn't a march, it's a meander. The tetrapodomorphs didn't step onto land to become us. They simply explored the edges of what was possible, and the rest followed. Still, it's difficult not to be awed by the elegance of their design. The bones in a Tiktaalik's fin, for example, are arranged in a way that perfectly mirrors the structure of a human arm. One long bone connecting to two smaller ones, followed by a cluster of smaller elements, the beginnings of a wrist. The shoulder girdle, once fused to the skull as in most fish, began to separate, allowing independent movement. These changes seem small until you realize what they enabled: the ability to push up, to look around, to brace against the pull of gravity. Inside every human gesture, every step, every reach, there's a memory of that first push against the mud. When paleontologists uncovered Tiktaalik's fossils in the Arctic in 2004, they were holding not just bones but a moment of transition frozen in stone. Its broad, flat head, crocodile-like body, and jointed fins seemed to say, "Here, this is the hinge where things began to turn." It filled a gap long suspected but never seen, the evolutionary bridge between lobe-finned fish and the earliest four-limbed vertebrates. The name itself, derived from an Inuit word for burbot or shallow water fish, feels fitting, a reminder that even in discovery we are still naming the same ancient relationship between life and water. It's worth pausing on what lobe-finned means. Unlike most modern fish, which have thin ray-like fins supported by spines of cartilage, lobe-finned fish, the sarcopterygians, possess fleshy, muscular fins supported by bones. You can picture them as underwater limbs, flexible and strong, capable of slow, deliberate movement. Within this group lie the ancestors of both the coelacanth and the lungfish, as well as the tetrapodomorphs. Their fins weren't designed for walking, but they were more versatile than the simple paddles of other fish. They could push, pivot, and stabilize. In the shifting mud and vegetation of shallow water, that difference meant survival. The more we study these animals, the more we realize how experimental evolution can be. Acanthostega had 8 digits on each limb, while Ichthyostega had 7. The number wasn't fixed yet. Nature was still testing possibilities. Some had tails adapted for swimming, others had stronger limbs for creeping. The variations tell us that there wasn't one single first creature to walk on land, but many small experiments happening in parallel, a whole generation of bodies rehearsing what it might mean to stand. And through it all, there's a kind of grace in their awkwardness. You can imagine them gliding along the bottom, using fins to prop themselves up, lifting their heads above the waterline to gulp air or watch for prey. Perhaps they basked in the warmth of the shallows, bodies half submerged, half exposed. Perhaps the feeling of gravity, though strange, became familiar, a kind of quiet intimacy between animal and planet. In every sense, tetrapodomorphs were bridges. They were bridges of anatomy, of environment, of time itself. Without them, there would be no lineage leading to amphibians, reptiles, birds, or mammals. Yet it's important to remember that they weren't moving toward us. Their story was their own, complete, self-contained, sufficient. They didn't know they were shaping the future. They were simply alive, responding to the world as it unfolded around them. The fossil record preserves their story in fragments: vertebrae, skulls, fin bones. But those fragments are eloquent. They tell us about courage without intention, adaptation without foresight. They remind us that the great transitions in life's history often begin not with grand gestures, but with small, uncertain movements. A push, a breath, a glance toward the surface. So when we think of Tiktaalik, or Acanthostega, or Ichthyostega, we should resist calling them fish or amphibian. Those words belong to our categories, not theirs. They were something in between, a wordless middle ground where boundaries blurred and possibilities multiplied. They were the Earth's first tentative steps toward land, written in muscle and bone instead of myth. In them, the planet was conducting an experiment in being. It was trying out a new rhythm, testing how flesh might work with gravity, how breath might move through air. The tetrapodomorphs were the Earth's first test subjects in the art of standing up. Picture them one last time. The sunlight glinting off scales that glimmer like wet copper, the fins pressing into mud, the head rising to taste the air. Around them the water ripples, the plants sway, and somewhere beneath the surface, the heart of evolution beats quietly on. They are half fish, half something else. Fishopods, as some scientists fondly call them, and though they vanished long ago, their legacy remains in every footstep that ever touched the land. In each of us, a small ancestral memory still whispers from the depths, the echo of gills, the yearning of lungs, the feeling of pushing up through water toward light. And if you listen closely enough, Just closely enough, you can almost hear it again, the sound of fins brushing mud, of a creature neither fish nor amphibian, hesitating at the edge of possibility, ready to take the first uncertain step into a world that had been waiting for it all along. Picture this. The air is thick and warm, the kind of heat that clings to everything. The sky has gone pale with drought. What was once a broad and glittering lagoon has begun to shrink, edges curling inward as the sun drinks the water away, mud cracks in wide, dark veins. The air tastes faintly of decay, of minerals left behind by the retreating water. Somewhere in that shrinking pool, a creature stirs, sluggish, gasping, restless. Its gills pull at water that grows thinner by the hour. It gulps toward the surface, draws in a breath of air, and moves slowly, awkwardly, toward a promise of deeper water beyond the cracked horizon. This is the image that haunted the imagination of scientists Samuel Wendell Williston, Richard Swan Lull, and later Alfred Romer in the early 20th century, the vision that became known as the shrinking pond hypothesis. It was one of the first great attempts to explain how and why certain fish might have begun the journey from water to land. But the key to this idea isn't ambition or conquest, it's survival. The creatures at the center of this theory didn't crawl onto land to escape the sea forever. They were simply trying not to die. The hypothesis is, at its heart, beautifully simple. During periods of seasonal drought, ancient ponds and shallow lakes would dry up. Fish living in these ephemeral habitats, places where the water came and went, would face a recurring crisis. As oxygen levels dropped and temperatures rose, only those with special adaptations could endure. Over time, certain species evolved lungs to breathe air directly and fins strong enough to push their bodies through mud in search of refuge. The journey across land wasn't a migration into a new world. It was a desperate crossing between one pocket of water and another. In the early 1900s, this idea captured the scientific imagination because it made intuitive sense. You could see it happening in miniature even today, in the behavior of living lungfish. These modern survivors, scattered across parts of Africa, South America, and Australia, are like living time capsules. When their ponds dry, they dig into the mud, secrete a cocoon around themselves, and wait out the drought in a state called estivation, slowing their metabolism to a whisper. They breathe air through lungs, surviving for months, sometimes even years, without a drop of liquid around them. When the rains return, they stir, break through their earthen shells, and return to the water as if nothing happened. It isn't difficult to imagine that their ancient ancestors might have faced similar conditions. The Devonian world was warm and variable, dotted with floodplains, deltas, and shallow wetlands that could disappear with the change of season or the shift of climate. In such a landscape, every drought would have been a test. Those that stayed behind in the drying pools would suffocate. Those that could move even slowly, even clumsily, might find salvation in the next pond over. And so, the shrinking pond hypothesis took shape. Evolution not as a leap of ambition, but as an act of necessity. It's a strangely humbling way to picture our distant origins. Not as a parade of progress, but as a crawl through mud, life, driven by thirst, by panic, by the quiet imperative to keep breathing. Imagine the scene as those ancient fish face the drying world. The water level falls day by day, revealing roots, stones, and silt that had never seen sunlight. The edges of the pond collapse into sticky, glistening mud. Small creatures, invertebrates, larvae, worms wriggle through the dampness, and the larger fish turn toward the deep, seeking the last refuge. But even the deepest pockets begin to vanish. The oxygen is nearly gone. The air above shimmers with heat. One creature, heavier and broader than the rest, moves upward. It gulps at the surface, eyes half above water, body flexing. Inside, its lungs, modified from ancient swim bladders, draw in air. It feels the strange relief of oxygen rushing through, the pulse of survival. The mud presses against its fins, and with a slow, muscular push, it begins to move forward, dragging itself toward a glimmer of water beyond the dying pool. Each movement is a labor. Each inch forward is a wager, the risk of drying out against the hope of a deeper pool ahead. It's easy to romanticize this moment as the first great journey of life onto land, but in truth it was anything but noble. It was desperation made flesh. Every movement was a question. Will there be water? Will there be air? Will I last long enough? The shrinking pond hypothesis sees evolution not as destiny, but as a series of emergency improvisations. In that view, the development of limbs, lungs, and mobility on land weren't part of some grand evolutionary plan. They were life's response to being cornered. The planet changed, and the only way forward was through mud. Alfred Romer, who expanded on this idea in the mid-20th century, imagined this cycle, repeating endlessly. Rain fills the ponds, fish breed and thrive, and then the dry season comes again. Each year, some perish, some adapt, and a few, by chance or endurance, crawl far enough to reach another refuge. Over millions of years, those small, desperate movements accumulate into anatomy, fins that bear weight, lungs that can sustain longer breaths, skin that tolerates brief exposure to air. Evolution in this sense is persistence stretched thin across time. To see what this might have looked like, you can look to the African lungfish, one of the few living creatures that still carries the blueprint of that ancient struggle. It lives in shallow, warm waters, streams, ponds, and floodplains that flood in the rainy season and all but vanish in the dry. When the water begins to evaporate, the lungfish senses the change. It burrows downward, tail wriggling, pushing through soft mud until it finds a moist pocket. Then, using mucus secreted from its skin, it builds a chamber around itself, sealing out the heat. Inside, it coils its body and waits. The gills, now useless in dry air, lie dormant, but the lungs continue their slow, rhythmic work. The heart rate falls, the metabolism slows. For months, even years, it remains in that suspended half-life, breathing the thin air through a narrow opening. When the rains finally return, the pond fills, the chamber softens, and the fish bursts free, wriggling into the newly replenished water, a small resurrection that has been playing out on Earth for over 100 million years. That behavior, that cycle of drowning and rebirth, is at the heart of the shrinking pond hypothesis. It shows that the ability to breathe air and move through mud isn't a theoretical possibility. It's a strategy, tested and proven, ancient and ongoing. When we picture those early fish crawling through the shallows, it's tempting to see them as explorers of the land. But the truth, as Lull and Romer saw it, is more tragic and more beautiful. They weren't discovering the world above. They were fleeing death below. They weren't pioneers of evolution. They were refugees of drought. And yet, through their struggle, something miraculous happened. Lungs became stronger, fins more flexible, muscles more precise. In trying to survive, they accidentally became capable of more. The power of this hypothesis lies in its humility. It reminds us that transformation often comes not from ambition but from necessity. Evolution doesn't plan for greatness, it stumbles into it. The shrinking pond is, in that sense, both a literal and metaphorical landscape, a place where crisis forces creativity, where life finds new forms not out of desire but out of need. And yet, there's a quiet poetry to the image of those ancient creatures crossing the mud. The landscape around them shimmering with heat, the sky pale and merciless, the air humming with the buzz of insects. The earth itself might have seemed alive with thirst, each pool a brief oasis, each breath a reprieve. In those moments, the planet wasn't inviting life to the land, it was demanding endurance. Survive, it whispered. Go on, if you can. When scientists first proposed this theory, they were trying to make sense of fossils that seemed caught between worlds, bones that looked like limbs, skulls that hinted at lungs. They saw in them not triumph, but tenacity. Lull and Romer looked at the shape of those fossils and imagined a creature pausing in the mud, sides heaving, eyes fixed on a patch of water in the distance. In that single image, they found an answer to one of evolution's great mysteries. Not why life wanted to leave the sea, but why it had to. Even today, that idea carries a kind of resonance. It speaks to something deep and human, the notion that change often begins in discomfort, that innovation comes when survival is at stake. The shrinking pond isn't just a biological hypothesis, it's a metaphor for life itself. When the environment turns harsh, when the familiar dries up, the instinct to move, to adapt, to push forward awakens. We crawl, not because we seek glory, but because we cannot stay still. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the rhythm of it. The faint rasp of movement through wet clay, the hiss of breath drawn from air. For the first time, you can feel the weight of a world caught between two elements, the security of water and the danger of land. The sun burns overhead, relentless. The earth smells of iron and salt, and in that in-between place, the first fumbling steps of an accident that would change everything are being taken. In that moment, evolution isn't a march or a plan. It's a heartbeat in the mud, a stubborn will to keep living. The shrinking pond is both a crucible and a classroom, teaching life how to survive where it was never meant. It is the planet's way of asking, again and again, how far will you go to endure? And so, through drought after drought, season after season, life learned. It learned to breathe air. It learned to move where fins once floundered. It learned to carry water within itself, so that when the world outside went dry, something still flowed inside. In the end, the shrinking pond hypothesis is not just about the origins of land-dwelling animals. It's about the quiet resilience that underlies all of life. The truth that change begins when survival demands it. That even the greatest transitions in history can begin with something as small as a fish gasping for breath in a puddle, following the shimmer of water through a landscape of cracked mud and relentless light. And perhaps in that shimmering distance, as the creature moves slowly, awkwardly, but determined, the earth itself watches, patient and amused, and whispers once more through the heat and haze. Go on, little one. The next pond is waiting. Science, like the earth itself, is fond of rearranging its surface. Ideas that once felt as solid as stone can erode under the slow wash of evidence. What we think of as firm ground often turns out to be the muddy bottom of a larger pool, one that shifts, fills, and empties as new discoveries come to light. And so it was with one of evolution's most evocative stories, that life's first steps onto land were driven by thirst, by desperation, by shrinking pools and a sun that refused to relent. But fossils, those stubborn keepers of truth, have begun to whisper a different story. It's a story less about dry mud and more about soft silt, less about crisis, more about curiosity. Over the decades, through digs in Greenland, Canada, and the Baltics, through microscopes and CT scans and the delicate brushwork of paleontologists, the tale has been rewritten layer by layer. And what the rocks seem to say with quiet certainty is this: our ancestors didn't crawl out of drying ponds at all. They were already breathing in the water. Let's start with lungs, the centerpiece of the old narrative, the miracle adaptation that supposedly allowed fish to gulp air when their ponds turned to soup. For most of the 20th century, that idea made perfect sense. If fish developed lungs to survive droughts, then those same lungs could later be repurposed for life on land. It was a tidy evolutionary arc, the kind that fits neatly into a textbook diagram, but the fossils say otherwise. By the mid-1900s, evidence began to accumulate that lungs were not a last-minute invention of desperate fish, but an ancient feature older than the creatures who would ever think to use them on land. Lung-like structures have been found in fossilized lobe-finned fish that lived long before the first tetrapods appeared. Even modern fish like beaches and gar still use lungs to breathe underwater, supplementing their gills in low-oxygen environments. In other words, lungs weren't an emergency adaptation to drought. They were a long-standing part of the aquatic toolkit. Useful, yes, but not proof of a mud-crawling exodus. The great irony is that lungs probably evolved in the water, not out of it. Oxygen doesn't dissolve easily, especially in warm, stagnant water. In such environments, fish with a secondary breathing organ had an advantage, not because the land was calling, but because the water was sometimes suffocating. Gulping air at the surface was simply a better way to stay alive in oxygen-poor shallows. It was a trick of physiology, not prophecy. Then came the fossils themselves, the bones that turned speculation into something more grounded. By the 1940s, the discovery of Eusthenopteron, a lobe-finned fish with both gills and lungs, began to blur the boundary between water and air. But the real upheaval came decades later, as new species were unearthed and old skeletons re-examined with modern tools. The picture that emerged was not of creatures stranded in drying ponds, but of animals thriving in lush, wet, swampy environments full of life and opportunity. Take Acanthostega, for example. When its remains were first studied in detail in the late 20th century, scientists realized that it was not a land walker at all. Its limbs, long thought to be for crawling, were far too weak to bear its weight out of water. Its digits were webbed, its tail broad and finned for swimming, its ribs too delicate to support a terrestrial stance. Acanthostega lived in water, breathed air occasionally, and paddled through dense vegetation like a modern salamander. Its so-called legs were more like stabilizers, helping it maneuver among submerged plants. In short, it was a water dweller experimenting with new ways to move within its own realm, not a pioneer striking out for the shore. That single realization sent ripples through evolutionary thought. The limbs that would one day allow animals to walk on land didn't evolve for walking. They evolved in water, for swimming, pushing, and clinging. The same bones that would later press against soil first pressed against the tangles of submerged logs and roots. Life's great leap onto land, it turned out, began with a sideways shuffle. And it wasn't just Acanthostega. Fossils of Ichthyostega, long hailed as one of the first true tetrapods, told a similar story. Its spine was strong, yes, but built more for powerful swimming strokes than for terrestrial stride. Its joints moved in limited arcs, better suited to paddling through shallows than trudging across mudflats. Even its so-called feet seemed to fan out like flippers. This was no land crusader. This was an aquatic animal, muscular, amphibious, graceful in its own medium. The notion of it dragging itself across cracked mud is now almost comic. It was, as one scientist put it, a swimmer with aspirations, but not yet a pedestrian. By the time Tiktaalik was discovered in 2004, the debate was already shifting. The environment that surrounded its fossils was not a desert of shrinking ponds, but a mosaic of slow-moving rivers and floodplains. The sediment spoke of humid conditions rich with vegetation, not drought. The mud preserved the delicate impressions of roots, leaves, and ripples, evidence of constant water flow. The habitat was a swamp, not a wasteland. The world of early tetrapodomorphs was wet, messy, and alive. And that changes everything. Because if the world wasn't drying up, then the Great Migration onto land wasn't an act of desperation at all. It was a side effect of exploration. Limbs and lungs were not emergency equipment, but versatile tools that allowed their owners to navigate complex environments. Tangled marshes, shallow estuaries, overgrown channels where swimming alone wasn't enough. In these settings, a fin that could push off a log or stabilize against current was as useful as a propeller. A neck that could pivot was a blessing in tight, crowded water. Evolution wasn't escaping anything, it was optimizing. You can imagine it, a dense green wetland, half water and half air, where sunlight filters through reeds and the water glows like tea. The ground beneath is soft but firm enough for a body to brace against. A creature rests there, half buried in the silt, waiting for prey to pass. When it moves, it doesn't walk. It glides, pushes, twists. Its fins flex against roots. Its body lifts for a moment, then settles again. It breathes, not because the world above demands it, but because oxygen below is scarce. Its lungs fill, gills flutter, life goes on. That's the world the fossils describe, a place of abundance, not crisis. A place where limbs and lungs were not escape routes, but innovations of convenience. By the 1990s and early 2000s, paleontologists began to view the shrinking pond story with something close to affection, like an old family myth, charming but outdated. The accumulating data pointed to a very different evolutionary pathway. The transition to land, rather than a single dramatic event, was a slow drift across countless generations. Water levels didn't drop overnight. Instead, bodies changed gradually, molded by subtler pressures. The need to ambush prey in shallow water, to gulp oxygen during bouts of low flow, to stabilize against currents in cluttered habitat. Lungs, it turned out, were older than legs, and legs were older than walking. The Earth, in its own patient way, was rearranging life not through catastrophe but through opportunity. There's something endearing about the way science handles these reversals. The shrinking pond hypothesis had a satisfying drama to it, a narrative of struggle and triumph. The newer version is less cinematic but more deeply beautiful. It replaces desperation with curiosity, struggle with adaptation, crisis with creativity. Instead of a gasping fish dragging itself through dust, picture a confident swimmer exploring the margins of its world, nudging into the shallows not because it must, but because it can. And there's humor in that too, because it shows how often we humans assume drama, where there was probably just gentle tinkering. Nature isn't always poetic in the way we want it to be. Sometimes it's more subtle, more mundane, and therefore more astonishing. The ancestors of all land animals might not have been tragic heroes of drought at all, but lazy loungers in swampy backwaters, experimenting with the evolutionary equivalent of standing up just to see if they could. Still, the new evidence doesn't erase the old idea entirely. It reframes it. The shrinking pond story may not have been literally true, but its spirit remains, that environmental pressure can create possibility. Only now, the pressure seems to have come not from absence, but from complexity. The Ebonian world was not drying. It was diversifying. It was full of shallow channels, mossy banks, and submerged forests that rewarded experimentation. In that rich patchwork of wetness, the first steps toward land were taken slowly, playfully, without any awareness of where they would lead. When you look at it that way, the narrative becomes even more remarkable. The creatures that would someday give rise to salamanders, reptiles, and humans didn't conquer the land through force of will. They slid into it, like water finding new paths. Theirs was not a march, but a drift. Not a crisis, but an accident of abundance. And perhaps that's the most humbling lesson of all. Evolution, for all its grandeur, rarely writes with intention. It scribbles, revises, crosses out and starts again. It tests the shape of the possible, and keeps whatever works. For millions of years, the muddy shallows were the testing ground. Limbs grew stronger, lungs more efficient, necks more flexible, all not to escape a drying world, but to better navigate a living one. The earth, meanwhile, kept whispering its quiet encouragement. Try this, try that, see what happens. And so the story of our ancestors changes. No parched ponds, no desperate journeys under a baking sun, just humid swamps and patient experiments, lungs breathing underwater, fins pressing against roots, eyes turning upward, not in panic, but in curiosity. Science moves like that too, slow, steady, correcting itself as it goes. Each fossil, each sediment layer, another gentle push toward clarity. And if we listen to what they tell us, it's not the tale of a dramatic escape, but of endless exploration. Life wasn't running from the water. It was, as ever, simply following it. In 2004, on a remote Arctic island called Ellesmere in northern Canada, a team of paleontologists brushed away the last grains of ancient stone and found, quite literally, the missing piece between two worlds. It was a fossil lying quiet and perfect, its scales still etched in stone, its outline so familiar and yet so strange. It was a fish, but one that seemed to be halfway through a transformation. Its name would soon become famous. Tiktaalik rosea, the bridge between the flowing world of the water and the uncertain firmness of land. To understand Tiktaalik is to stand at the edge of two elements and feel the pull of both. The Earth, 35 million years ago, was a landscape of slow-moving channels and green, humid swamps. In those shallows, sunlight reached the bottom. Plants rose in mats of moss and primitive ferns. The water was warm, oxygen poor, crowded with life. Here, among roots and reeds, Tiktaalik thrived, not in the open sea, but in narrow, intimate waterways where every movement required precision, balance, and strength. The creature's body was long, sleek, and armored in overlapping scales that shimmered bronze and copper when wet. Its head was wide and flat, like a crocodile's, with eyes perched on top rather than the sides, perfect for peering upward toward the light or scanning the surface for prey. Its mouth was broad, lined with small, sharp teeth, built not for chewing but for gripping. It wasn't designed for speed, it was built for ambush. But what truly set Tiktaalik apart were its fins. At first glance, they looked like any other lobe-finned fish, sturdy and fleshy, with a jointed structure. Yet hidden within them was something miraculous, bones that foreshadowed the architecture of every future arm and leg. Inside that fin was a primitive version of the shoulder, the elbow, And even the wrist. It was not a leg, not yet, but it could bend, press, and lift. When Tiktaalik pushed itself along the bottom of its shallow river, its fins didn't simply wave. They planted, they anchored, they moved with purpose. You can imagine it gliding through the dappled light of a Devonian swamp, half swimming, half walking, its body low to the mud. It would rest among the roots of ancient plants, body hidden, eyes breaking the surface like a periscope. When prey, perhaps a smaller fish or an insect that had fallen into the water, drifted near, it would surge forward with a slow, powerful stroke, jaws snapping shut with a soft, satisfying click. It wasn't a land animal. It couldn't have walked across open ground, not even for a few steps. Its ribs were strong, but not enough to bear its full weight in air. Its skin was designed for water, its breathing system still tied to the rhythms of the river. Yet, compared to other fish of its time, it had something special: freedom, a neck. Almost all fish have heads fused directly to their shoulders. They move their bodies to turn their gaze. Tiktaalik broke that rule. Its neck was mobile, a small but profound innovation. It could raise its head, look around, adjust its view without shifting its entire body. That meant awareness. It could stay hidden in reeds, while its eyes scanned for opportunity. It could lift its head above the surface, to gulp air or simply to watch the world above. That neck, a hinge between worlds, made Tiktaalik one of the most pivotal creatures in evolutionary history. It wasn't a fish anymore, not entirely, but it wasn't yet a land dweller. It was something in between, an experiment written in bone and breath. The environment it lived in would have demanded versatility. Imagine a vast, interwoven delta, shallow streams meandering through mudbanks, vegetation dipping into the current, the air thick with humidity and the soft buzz of ancient insects. The water was full of obstacles, logs, roots, plants, rocks. To navigate such a maze, you didn't need the elegance of a swimmer, you needed the control of a crawler. Tiktaalik's fins were perfect for this. It could prop itself up, shift sideways, wedge between roots, even lift part of its body out of the water to bask. Its scales provided armor against the abrasive world of mud and grit. Its tail still carried the strength for propulsion, but its fins were taking on a new task: exploration. If you could travel back to that ancient river and watch Tiktaalik move, you'd see a rhythm unlike anything before it. The creature would push off with its fins, gliding forward, then pause to rest on its elbows, letting the water support most of its weight. Its body would undulate slightly, using both the grace of a swimmer and the balance of something that could almost walk. Its head would turn, eyes scanning above and below. Then, with a subtle, practiced motion, it would move again, not so much swimming or crawling as testing the limits of both. When the fossil was first revealed to the world, it caused an almost electric excitement among scientists. Here, finally, was the long-sought intermediate, the missing link between water and land. It was not a mythic creature, not a sudden step, but a mosaic of traits. It had gills and lung. It had fins and wrists. It had the body of a fish and the posture of something on the verge of standing. But beyond its anatomy, what makes Tiktaalik so extraordinary is the story it tells about evolution itself. The discovery showed that nature rarely draws straight lines. It prefers gradients, transitions, slow fusions of form. The shift from sea to land was not a leap across a void. It was a slow drift across a marsh. Each adaptation that made Tiktaalik successful in its watery world also brought it closer to something new. Its lungs, for example, were not a landward innovation but a survival tool for shallow water. In those warm, stagnant channels, oxygen levels could fluctuate wildly. Having lungs meant being able to gulp air when gills couldn't pull enough from the water. Its strong ribs helped it breathe under the pressure of air when it rose to the surface. Its neck made it a better hunter in tight, vegetated spaces. Its fins, sturdy and flexible, gave it leverage over logs and debris. None of these traits evolved for walking on land, yet together they created an animal that could. That's the poetry of evolution. It doesn't plan, but it builds possibilities. Tiktaalik didn't want to crawl onto land any more than a modern fish wants to build a skyscraper. But its body, shaped by countless small advantages, carried the potential. When those traits came together, a threshold was crossed. One so subtle at first that it would take millions of years before anyone noticed. And what a threshold it was. In Tiktaalik, we see the whisper of everything to come, of amphibians, reptiles, mammals, humans. Every muscle that lifts your arm, every joint that bends your wrist, carries an echo of that ancient design. The bones inside your hand are the bones inside its fin, translated through time. The simple act of lifting a glass or reaching for a light switch is, in a way, a continuation of Tiktaalik's first push against the riverbed. There's a kind of humble grandeur in that realization. This wasn't a grand moment of conquest, no triumphant march from water to land. It was a quiet, instinctive gesture, a creature moving through its world, doing what it needed to do, and in the process inventing the architecture of all future movement. You can almost imagine the scene as twilight falls over the Devonian swamp. The air cools slightly. Mist rises from the water's surface. Tiktaalik rests near the edge of a channel, its body half in shadow, half in golden light. A dragonfly the size of a hand drifts overhead. Somewhere nearby, another Tiktaalik shifts in the mud, sending ripples across the water. The sounds are soft. The rustle of reeds, the faint splash of a tail, the hush of a world halfway made. Above, stars begin to glimmer faintly through the haze. They have been burning for billions of years. Unaware that below, in the muddy shallows of a small river, a creature is taking the first steps towards something entirely new, lungs filling, neck turning, fins pressing gently into the earth. It's tempting to call Tiktaalik a bridge, but that word feels almost too deliberate. Bridges are built. Tiktaalik was discovered, not designed. Its body simply carried within it the solution to a problem the Earth didn't even know it had yet. How to link two worlds without breaking either. In its elegant confusion, its mixture of old and new, of water and air, of fish and something beyond fish, Tiktaalik embodies the essence of evolution itself. Change doesn't happen in revolutions, but in ripples. What began as a slight bend in a fin would one day become a stride. What began as a turn of the neck would one day become a gaze at the stars. So yes, Tiktaalik is a fossil, a stone pressed with history, but it's also a reminder of motion, of the way life leans forward, always experimenting, always stretching the limits of its own design. It is the Earth's own curiosity, given shape and scale. If you close your eyes, you can still see it there, half fish, half something else, moving through the shallow water like a thought forming for the first time. It pauses, flexes its fin, lifts its head just above the surface. The air shimmers, the water hums, and somewhere, in that slow, patient moment, the world itself seems to whisper, "Hold on, try this." And Tiktaalik does, pressing gently into the mud. Steady, graceful, unaware that in that small gesture it has already begun to change everything. About 3.65 million years ago, on what is now the icy island of Greenland, the world was a tropical swamp, a green cathedral of warmth and stillness. Rivers wound lazily through forests of ferns and early trees, their roots tangled in thick, silty mud. The air was heavy, humming with insects, the size of your hand. Beneath the dark, tea-colored water, something moved slow, deliberate, graceful. Its limbs paddled in wide arcs. Its tail swayed with steady rhythm. To the casual observer, it might have looked like an oversized salamander. But this was no ordinary swimmer. This was Acanthostega, a creature balanced perfectly on the boundary between two realms. It had four limbs, true limbs, not fins. Each ended not in soft rays, but in distinct digits. 8 fingers on each front limb, arranged like a fan, flexible and webbed. A miracle of bone and cartilage. Yet despite those limbs, or perhaps because of them, Acanthostega could not truly walk. Its skeleton, though complex, was too delicate to bear its full weight on land. Its ribs were narrow, its backbone pliant. Try to picture it standing, and you'll see it sag under its own softness. But in the water, oh, in the water, it was elegance itself. Acanthostega moved not with the ease of a fish, nor the stride of an amphibian, but with a kind of playful improvisation between the two. Its limbs weren't tools for walking. They were steering oars, perfect for pushing against submerged plants, anchoring in soft mud, or gliding through tangles of underwater stems. The creature's tail, long and finned, did most of the work, sweeping side to side in broad, efficient strokes. The limbs added grace, control, a touch of finesse. It was like watching a ballet dancer practice underwater, every movement suspended, deliberate and slightly absurd. Its head was broad and flat, its eyes set high on the skull, a design that hints at a life spent near the surface, peering upward through the dappled light of a Devonian swamp. It breathed air, yes, through lungs inherited from ancient ancestors, but it also retained gills, which fluttered delicately when submerged. It lived in a world where breathing was optional, depending on the mood of the water. Sometimes oxygen-rich, sometimes depleted, sometimes both at once. Flexibility was everything. If you could follow Acanthostega through its day, you'd find a creature content to stay close to the comfort of its element. In the morning, or what passed for morning under the thick greenish light, it might hover among the reeds, waiting for smaller fish or aquatic insects to drift by. When something moved, it would dart forward, snapping with jaws lined by sharp little teeth that curved backward like hooks. Its bite wasn't strong, but its aim was precise. Then, sated, it would settle back into the weeds, letting the water hold its weight, lungs and gills sharing the labor of breath. There's a kind of lazy joy in imagining it. This early, almost amphibian floating, paddling, utterly unbothered by the notion of land. Scientists once assumed that creatures like Acanthostega must have been in the middle of some grand migration out of the water. But the fossils tell a more comical, charming truth. Acanthostega didn't care for land at all. It had the tools for walking, but no intention of using them that way. Its limbs weren't made for marching, they were made for maneuvering. The bones tell the story. Each limb was strong at the base but soft toward the edges. The joints lacked the locks and levers that would make standing possible. Instead, they moved like paddles, sweeping outward and backward in fluid art. Imagine a rower's stroke or a dog's slow swim. That's the rhythm of Acanthostega. The earth, perhaps amused, seemed to whisper, "Walk if you like, but the water suits you better." When the first nearly complete fossil of Acanthostega was found in Greenland in the 1980s, it changed everything. Until then, most paleontologists believed the earliest tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that would one day give rise to amphibians, reptiles and mammals, had evolved their legs for walking on land. But Acanthostega upended that neat progression. Its anatomy was clearly adapted for water, not land. Its limbs were a prelude, not a performance. The great evolutionary debut of walking, it seemed, had been rehearsed underwater. And what a rehearsal it was. Picture a swamp thick with life, giant horsetails, fern-like trees, mats of algae floating on still water. The surface is dappled with sunlight, broken by ripples and shadows. Beneath, the water is murky but alive, full of tiny crustaceans, larval insects, and smaller fish. Acanthostega glides through this microcosm like a dream, its body shimmering in the filtered light, its 8-fingered limbs pressing gently against the current. When it moves, it stirs the sediment, creating little clouds that drift like smoke. Occasionally it pushes upward, breaking the surface for a gulp of air. Its nostrils open, its lungs expand. Then, with a subtle twist of the tail, it sinks again, exhaling a stream of bubbles. Above the surface, the swamp buzzes with primitive insects, a world it will never truly join. Its body is too heavy for that. Its skin too porous, its heart still tied to the rhythm of the water. And yet, unknowingly, it carries within it the blueprint of all who will someday leave. Each limb, each vertebra, each breath is a step in a long improvisation that will continue for millions of years. But Acanthostega itself is perfectly at home. It doesn't dream of conquest or evolution. It drifts, it hunts, it rests, it lives. There's something endearingly relatable about this creature, a transitional being that refuses to rush. In the grand drama of evolution, Acanthostega is the character who never reads the script. Everyone expects it to climb ashore and declare, "At last, dry land." Instead, it stays in the pool, waving its stubby limbs as if to say, "I'm good here, thanks." But make no mistake, it was a revolutionary in its own quiet way. Those 4 limbs with their delicate digits represented one of life's great experiments. The transition from fins to fingers didn't happen in an instant. It unfolded through creatures like Acanthostega, who took their time perfecting the choreography. Its skeleton shows the first true wrists and elbows, the kind that could flex and rotate. Its shoulder girdle was separated from the skull, granting it a limited but real ability to move its head independently, a small but vital step toward the mobility that later tetrapods would master. Still, it was no landwalker. If you were to lift Acanthostega gently out of the water and set it on a riverbank, it would flop helplessly, tail thrashing, limbs flailing, mouth opening in silent protest. Within minutes, its gills would dry, its lungs would strain, and it would long for the soft embrace of the swamp. The earth might whisper, half teasing, half compassionate, "Not yet. Go back, you're not ready." And back it would go, sliding with relief into the cool, forgiving water. That's the beauty of Acanthostega. It didn't need to conquer anything to be extraordinary. It was both ancient and modern, primitive and sophisticated. Its body was a living compromise. Lungs for the air, gills for the water, limbs that hinted at walking but perfected swimming. It was, in essence, the amphibious dream made real, not the dream of leaving, but of belonging to both worlds. When scientists reconstructed its bones and realized that its skeleton couldn't support it on land, there was a collective moment of wonder, followed by laughter. It was as if evolution had gotten ahead of itself, building legs before realizing the owner had no intention of using them that way. One paleontologist joked that Acanthostega was the first animal to invent the elbow and immediately use it for paddling. But in that humor lies awe. Every bone in Acanthostega's body tells a story of potential. Evolution doesn't think ahead, it stumbles into genius by accident. A limb meant for pushing through weeds becomes much later a limb that can lift a body, climb a hill, play a violin. The first fingers to press against the riverbed would one day press keys on a piano. For now, though, those 8 fingers move only through water. They dig gently into the mud, guiding the creature through the dense aquatic forest. The water hugs its sides, the plants brush against its skin. Sunlight filters down in green-gold streaks. The swamp is alive with quiet sound, the slow drip of condensation, the faint crackle of roots. In that suspended world, Acanthostega glides like a thought unspoken, an idea just forming. Perhaps that's why this creature feels so strangely poetic. It embodies the moment between possibilities, neither here nor there, neither past nor future. It is evolution caught in the act of dreaming. If the Devonian world could speak, it might murmur to Acanthostega, "Stay a while, the land will wait." And indeed it did. For millions of years after, others would follow, building upon the same design: stronger limbs, stiffer spines, drier skins, each a variation on the theme first hinted at in that graceful 8-fingered swimmer. But Acanthostega itself needed no improvement. It was perfect for its time, a creature that lived at the edge of innovation, blissfully unaware of the legacy written in its bones. So imagine it once more: the sluggish current, the faint light through the ferns, the glimmer of scales beneath the surface. Acanthostega paddles lazily through the shallows, limbs stirring the silt, tail flicking with quiet power. Every motion is a whisper of things to come, but it doesn't know that. It doesn't need to. It simply moves as the water murmurs around it, and the earth, indulgent and amused, seems to sigh softly and say, "Float if you wish, little one, the land can wait. For now, just glide." Imagine, if you can, the sound of something heavy moving through wet mud. A slow, rhythmic scrape, a soft sigh of displaced water, a quiet exhale between effort and rest. Now picture the creature behind that sound, a broad-bodied animal, with the shimmer of fish scales and the posture of an awkward pioneer. Its limbs dig into the silt, its tail flicks weakly, its body heaves forward in short, deliberate bursts. It looks, in some lights, like a lizard, in others, like a stranded fish. This is Ichthyostega, one of the first creatures to truly test the uncertain boundary between water and land. But don't be fooled by the mythology of evolution's first walker. Ichthyostega didn't stride confidently onto dry earth, declaring the age of land animals begun. No, it came ashore the way a seal does, dragging, sliding, flopping, pausing to catch its breath. then dragging again. It was the world's first tentative tourist on land, not a resident. Some 360 million years ago, in a landscape of swamps and slow rivers, Ichthyostega thrived. The earth was warmer then, its air thick with humidity, its surface green with fern forests and mossy wetlands. The world smelled of damp soil and life fermenting beneath the water's surface. The murk was alive with motion. Small fish, insects, and strange crustaceans drifting through tangles of roots. This was Ichthyostega's kingdom, a shallow, breathing world between two elements, where water lapped over soft mud and the line between river and land blurred like a watercolor painting. Its body was built for this amphibious twilight. Nearly 5 feet long from snout to tail, Ichthyostega was powerfully muscled, but oddly proportioned. Its ribs were thick and sturdy, far more robust than those of any fish before it, forming a protective cage that could support its organs when lifted from the buoyant cradle of water. Its spine, too, was strengthened and flexible, giving it control over each movement. But its limbs, though impressive, were not the limbs of a walker. They were more like paddles, capable of pushing and hauling, not of striding. Each front limb could anchor the creature in mud, while the rear limbs, wider and flatter, added thrust as it dragged itself forward. On land, it likely moved much like a modern seal, head low, chest lifting and falling, the front limbs pulling the body along in heavy, sweeping motions. Its belly would have scraped the ground, its tail would have trailed behind, leaving faint furrows in the soft earth. If you were to see it in motion, you might find the sight oddly endearing, half comedy, half wonder. Evolution, it seemed, was learning to crawl all over again. Yet for all its clumsy effort on land, Ichthyostega was a master in the water. Its long, muscular tail was lined with fin rays, giving it the power to swim in strong, sinuous strokes. Its hind limbs, though sturdy, worked almost like oars, pushing against the current to steer or stabilize. When it slipped below the surface, its movements grew elegant, fluid. The awkwardness of land melted away. Here, in its element, it could glide effortlessly, a creature designed for the in-between. And yet, what truly fascinated scientists about Ichthyostega wasn't how it moved, but how it ate. For decades, paleontologists assumed that these early amphibians might have hunted both underwater and on land, snapping up insects or small prey at the water's edge. But a 2013 study of Ichthyostega's jaw and skull revealed something unexpected. It couldn't have fed on land at all. Its jaws were built like those of a fish, not a land predator. The joint structure, the muscle attachments, and the hinge all indicated a mechanism suited for suction feeding, drawing prey into the mouth by creating a sudden vacuum, a technique that only works underwater. On land, such a design would have been useless. Without the resistance of water, it couldn't have generated the pressure difference needed to pull anything in. The creature's powerful jaws would have opened and closed in air with no effect, like a fish gasping. So Ichthyostega may have lifted its head above the surface, blinked in the heavy air, and perhaps even crawled onto the muddy shore to bask or escape danger. But when it came to eating, it always returned to the water. That was where its instincts and its body belonged. It's tempting to anthropomorphize that hesitation, to see Ichthyostega as a reluctant traveler, dipping its limbs into new territory but never quite ready to stay. Its life was likely a rhythm of both worlds, mornings spent basking in shallows, afternoons hunting in deeper water, nights resting in the cool silt. It would have moved between these spaces with slow confidence, never rushing, never truly choosing one over the other. The earth, indulgent and patient, seemed to whisper, "Take your time, little one. There's no hurry." Visually, Ichthyostega must have been striking. Its broad, flat head rose from the water like a dark wedge. Its eyes sat high on its skull, giving it a panoramic view of both the surface and what lay above. It could watch the dance of light through ripples, the silhouettes of insects on the water, perhaps even the rustle of primitive plants at the shore. Its skin, slick and scaled, caught the reflections of sunlight, a living mosaic of bronze and grey. When it breathed air, its nostrils opened, just above the waterline, the lungs expanding quietly beneath its ribs. When it dove, the nostrils sealed, and the gills, remnants of its ancient fish ancestry, fluttered into action. There's an almost cinematic beauty to imagining it moving through the shallows. Picture the water dark and still, filled with the scent of algae and decay. Ichthyostega hovers just below the surface, motionless but alert. Then a flicker, a smaller fish darting nearby. In an instant it lunges, jaws snapping, a burst of bubbles rising as it captures its meal. Satisfied, it settles again, tail slowly waving. The silence returns. Every part of its anatomy speaks to compromise. It wasn't built for perfection, but for possibility. Its ribs were strong enough to lift part of its body, but not enough to sustain long excursions on land. Its limbs could support short bursts of movement, but not a true stride. Its lungs gave it breath in air, but its gills still tethered it to water. Even its ears, adapted for detecting sound underwater, remind us that it belonged to two acoustic worlds, hearing both the murmur of currents and the distant vibrations of air. And yet, for all its awkwardness, Ichthyostega was a marvel of engineering. It had 7 toes on each hind limb, a number that seems strange to us now, but perfectly natural in a time when the blueprint of tetrapod life was still being drafted. Its skeleton shows a remarkable blend of strength and flexibility, suggesting it could haul itself over obstacles and perhaps even onto half-submerged logs or roots. Imagine it basking there, the first of its kind to rest with its body partly supported by something solid, tail hanging in the water, lungs filled with humid air. That moment, so ordinary, so small, is one of the great turning points in the history of life. Ichthyostega wasn't inventing walking. It was inventing staying still. It was learning to pause between elements, to hold itself in the space where water and land meet. It was, in a sense, learning to be both. The paleontologists who first studied its fossils in the mid-20th century were astonished by how advanced it seemed, and how strangely familiar. Here was an animal that seemed to wear its evolutionary story on its sleeve, scales and limbs, tail and lungs, ancient and new all at once. It had the look of something halfway through a sentence. Once upon a time there was a fish who, and then the line fades into mud and bone. By the early 2010s, when its jaw mechanics were finally understood, the narrative shifted again. The hero of the old story, the triumphant fish that conquered land, was gone. What replaced it was something more subtle, more truthful, and perhaps more beautiful. Ichthyostega wasn't a conqueror, it was an explorer who never stopped loving home. If you were to stand on the banks of its ancient river and watch, you'd see it drag itself forward a few feet, body glistening, tail marking the mud. Its chest would rise and fall, sides expanding as lungs drew in the thick air. Maybe it paused, blinking in the dim light filtering through swamp trees. Then slowly it would turn back, sliding once more into the water, with a sound like relief. There's a kind of quiet humor in imagining that the first tetrapod on the brink of a revolution, and it decides, no thanks, the mud's nicer. Evolution doesn't move in straight lines. It meanders, it experiments, it hesitates. Ichthyostega was part of that hesitation, the living embodiment of a world learning what limbs could do. If the Devonian earth could have spoken to it, perhaps it would have murmured with gentle amusement, "You don't have to walk, dear one. Just keep crawling. We'll get there eventually." And Ichthyostega would have obeyed, dragging itself along the shallows, tail sweeping, jaws snapping softly, as if nodding to say, "One day maybe, but not yet." And so, through that slow, lumbering grace, the future was written. Every awkward push through mud was a rehearsal. Every breath of air was practice for what was to come. But Ichthyostega itself was no transitional failure. It was perfect in its own right, perfect for a world of swamps and shallows, of half light and half land. If you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The faint scrape of limbs in wet earth, the sigh of water returning to its bed, the heartbeat of a creature that straddled two worlds without ever fully leaving either. In that sound lies the memory of every creature that would come after, every frog, every lizard, every seal, every human. But in that moment, there is only Ichthyostega, shining faintly under a Devonian sun, body heavy with history, moving with the patience of the planet itself. The earth, smiling in its slow way, seems to whisper once more through the reeds and ripples, "Drag on, little one. You are exactly where you need to be." Sometimes the earth tells its stories not through words but through whispers of stone. Every fossil, every grain of sediment, every weathered layer of rock carries a memory of movement, of breath, of worlds long gone. But in 2021, in the windswept cliffs of Nova Scotia, those whispers grew louder. Paleontologists studying ancient bones, the silent remains of some of the earliest tetrapods, uncovered evidence that changed how we imagine our own ancestors. For centuries, we've pictured them crawling onto land, awkward and triumphant, testing their new limbs on firm ground. But these bones, delicate, fractured, eloquent, told another tale entirely, a story not of dry earth, but of water. The fossils came from the Joggins Formation, a stretch of cliffs where time itself seems exposed. Layer upon layer of Carboniferous mudstone rises above the Bay of Fundy, each stratum a page in the planet's autobiography. Trees fossilized in place still stand upright, their roots reaching into the ancient soil. Within that vertical library, scientists found the bones of early tetrapods, creatures who lived some 310 million years ago, long after the first tentative steps toward land had been taken. By this time, one might think that the transition was complete, that these beings had truly become terrestrial. But the bones, when examined closely, whispered something different. Under the microscope, the researchers saw patterns, microscopic cracks, compression marks, traces of mechanical stress. These weren't random. They were signatures, subtle as fingerprints, left by the forces those bones endured in life. Bone, after all, is not static. It grows, reshapes, repairs. Every movement leaves a mark, every strain a faint record. And these marks, these patterns of wear and remodeling, revealed something astonishing. The stresses matched those found in modern aquatic animals, not land dwellers. The limbs of these ancient tetrapods didn't bear the kinds of pressures associated with walking or supporting weight on dry ground. Instead, the forces were consistent with swimming, with pushing and paddling through water, with anchoring to submerged surfaces, with maneuvering rather than marching. Their bones, in other words, told the story of creatures still very much at home in the water. It was as if after hundreds of millions of years, those bones had finally decided to correct the record. We never left, they seemed to whisper. We were never meant for the dust and the air. Our limbs weren't for walking. They were for gliding, for balancing, for dancing beneath the reeds. That quiet revelation rippled through the scientific community. For generations, paleontologists had imagined the early tetrapods as reluctant pioneers, gasping, staggering, inching onto land in a kind of evolutionary triumph. But the 2021 study suggested a gentler, wetter truth. The first true limbs and necks may not have evolved for land at all, but for life within the shallows, for swimming through cluttered vegetation, for pushing against the drag of roots and stems, for exploring the dense, living labyrinths of Devonian and Carboniferous swamps. The bones of the Nova Scotia fossils bore this story with surprising clarity. Their structure was spongy and light, adapted not for bearing full weight, but for buoyancy. Their joint surfaces were shaped for wide, flexible motion rather than the rigid locking needed for walking. Even the muscle attachments, those subtle scars where tendons once clung, suggested motion through resistance, not against gravity. It was a skeleton designed for water, for fluidity, for grace beneath the surface. The evidence for a primarily aquatic lifestyle became even more striking when researchers compared the fossils' microstructures to those of living animals. The stress patterns in these ancient bones mirrored those in modern amphibious creatures like salamanders and aquatic reptiles. The repetitive strain of paddling, of pushing sideways, of leveraging against water currents, all of it was there, encoded in the ancient bone. It was as though the creature's bodies still hummed with the rhythm of the water, even after 300 million years of silence. If we step back and imagine the world they lived in, the picture becomes clearer. The Carboniferous period was lush, humid, overflowing with plant life. Vast forests of club mosses and horsetails towered over slow-moving rivers. Swamps spread endlessly, their surfaces carpeted with floating vegetation. Oxygen levels were higher than today, and the air hung heavy with the scent of decay and life intertwined. In such a world, water was never far. Even land was often little more than saturated ground. It was a realm made for half measures, neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial, a mosaic of puddles, channels, and bogs. In that labyrinth of water and vegetation, a creature with limbs was not a clumsy wanderer, but a specialist. It could use its arms to push away floating debris, to anchor itself against current, to climb along the submerged stems of trees. Its neck, newly liberated from the constraints of its fish-like ancestors, allowed it to pivot, to look upward, to glance around corners of roots and branches. To call it walking would be misleading. It was more like crawling through a liquid garden, moving with precision and patience. The bones from Nova Scotia, in their silent geometry, revealed this way of life. They told of a world where limbs were not a declaration of independence from the sea, but an adaptation to a richer underwater existence, where the first elbows and wrists were less about locomotion and more about control, about the ability to stay still, to balance, to hold position in a flowing current. And perhaps most beautifully, these fossils reminded us that evolution's great inventions often begin as side effects. Limbs didn't evolve for conquest. They evolved for stability. Necks didn't appear to lift heads high in the dry air. They appeared so animals could better aim and navigate through water thick with vegetation. What we see, looking backward as progress, the march from water to land, was in reality a series of gentle adjustments to aquatic life. Land just happened to be nearby. It's an idea that feels both humbling and poetic. For centuries, humanity has imagined its origins as a climb, from the sea to the shore, from the mud to the sky. But the bones whisper something softer, something truer, that our story began not with a conquest, but with a float, that our first ancestors didn't emerge victorious from the water, but simply moved within it more efficiently. When scientists analyzed the bone structure in even greater detail, using imaging techniques that reveal growth rings and internal architecture, they found further support for this watery narrative. The internal bone density fluctuated in patterns that matched aquatic lifestyles, lighter near the joints, denser toward the core. This distribution, seen today in aquatic mammals and amphibians, helps balance buoyancy and stability underwater. On land, where gravity dominates, the pattern would be reversed. In essence, the bones carried within them the echo of water's embrace. It's strangely moving, this notion that bone, the hardest part of us, is shaped by something as fluid as habit. Each stroke, each push through the current, leaves an invisible mark that outlasts flesh and time. In those ancient tetrapods, the story of movement became a story of memory, written in calcium and crystal. The limbs that would someday climb mountains were first storytellers of rivers. Standing on the cliffs of Nova Scotia today, one can almost feel that deep past still breathing beneath the stone. The Bay of Fundy's tides, the highest in the world, rise and fall with ancient precision, as if echoing the pulse of the seas that once filled these valleys. The rocks gleam after rain, slick and dark, and you can almost imagine the shapes that moved through these waters long ago. Creatures with broad heads and curious eyes, drifting and climbing, testing their limits not out of need, but out of instinct. If those early tetrapods could speak, perhaps they would laugh gently at our obsession with leaving the water. To them, land was just another part of the same world, wetter or drier, depending on the season. Their lives weren't about choosing between two elements. They were about belonging to both. The researchers who uncovered this evidence in 2021 didn't just rewrite a chapter of evolution. They deepened its poetry. They showed that the origin of limbs and necks, those marvels of biological engineering, wasn't born from crisis, but from curiosity. It was the product of life learning to navigate complexity, the clutter of plants, the pull of currents, the uneven ground beneath shallow streams. The earliest tetrapods weren't running from drought or danger. They were exploring a richer version of the water they already knew. In the end, the bones from Nova Scotia remind us that every great transformation begins quietly. There was no triumphant march onto land, no single moment of exodus. There was only movement, slow, fluid, persistent, and the subtle shaping of bone beneath the skin. The earth, in its slow voice, might have murmured to those early wanderers, "Stay a while. Learn the weight of water. There's more to master before you rise." And they did. They pushed through reeds, balanced on roots, turned their heads toward the light, filtering through the surface. They breathed when they needed to, swam when they wished to, and let their bones record the story of each motion. Today, when we look at those ancient remains, polished and fragile under museum glass, we're not just seeing skeletons, we're seeing sentences in the planet's oldest language. Sentences written not with ink, but with effort. Not with words, but with movement. And what do those sentences say? Something simple, perhaps, but enduring. Something. We were swimmers, not walkers. The world was water, and we belonged to it. Our bones remember. Listen. Sometimes nature invents something for one reason and ends up using it for another. It is one of the most beautiful contradictions in the history of life. The phenomenon scientists call exaptation, when a trait evolves for one purpose, and later, by chance and circumstance, becomes perfect for something entirely new. It is the poetry of unintended consequence, the quiet improvisation that underlies evolution itself. The story of life on land, our story, is filled with these accidental triumphs. Limbs that began as paddles for navigating dense underwater forests would one day become legs for walking. Necks that evolved to help creatures glance sideways through murky water would one day let them lift their heads to the open sky. Bones that thickened to resist the gentle pressure of water would someday bear the full weight of gravity. None of this was planned. Evolution doesn't plan, it adapts, and sometimes, in adapting to one challenge, it accidentally prepares for another. That's the heart of exaptation, the lucky reuse of what already exists. It is evolution's version of a happy accident, when the earth whispers, "Try this," and the result happens to work elsewhere too. Imagine then, a warm world long before forests covered the continents, about 75 million years ago. Rivers meander through shallow wetlands. The air is rich and heavy. Beneath the surface of these swamps, the light filters down in green shafts, illuminating a tangle of roots and reeds. Here among the plants live the ancestors of land vertebrates. Creatures like Tiktaalik, though we won't name them now, they have strong fins, muscular and jointed, with bones that let them push against the bottom. Their eyes sit high on their heads, their necks flexible, their ribs strong. All of it, every feature is designed for a world of water, not land. The limbs help them crawl through the clutter of submerged vegetation, bracing against branches or lifting their heads above the surface to gulp air. The neck gives them freedom to look sideways, to track prey or avoid predators in the maze of roots. The sturdy ribs protect their lungs as they move in shallow water, where the pressure shifts with each rise and fall. They are perfectly tuned for the swamps, balanced between fluid and solidity, buoyed but not weightless. None of them knows that their bodies are rehearsing for a different world entirely. Evolution is not an engineer. It does not foresee outcomes. It simply tinkers, reshapes, reuses. The traits that help these creatures thrive in their watery homes have no goal beyond survival. But time, as always, has its own rhythm. The earth begins to change. The continents drift. Rivers carve new paths. And some of the great wetlands begin to retreat. The air grows more variable. The seasons more pronounced. Floodplains dry, then flood again. Each shift creates new spaces. Tidal flats, muddy deltas, exposed banks. The line between water and land becomes a flickering boundary. For the creatures of the shallows, it's not catastrophe, it's opportunity. Those same limbs that once pressed against the bottom now find purchase on damp ground. Those same necks that twisted beneath the reeds now swivel toward insects crawling on the bank. Those same ribs that once guarded lungs from the pressure of shallow water now protect them from the pull of gravity. None of these changes were for land, but they work there astonishingly well. That is exaptation, the reuse of the familiar for the unfamiliar. Evolution's great irony is that progress often comes by accident, by borrowing an old tool for a new job. Think of the first time one of these creatures clambered onto a patch of half-dry mud. The waterline behind it glimmered, the air above hot and bright. Its body strained under its own weight. Muscles built for swimming now labored against gravity. Yet the limbs held, the chest rose, the neck turned, the creature breathed. Each motion, once made for water, found a new rhythm on land. It wasn't elegance, it was improvisation. But in that awkward shuffle lay the beginning of something vast. We often imagine evolution as a ladder, one step leading neatly to the next, but exaptation reveals a truer image. Evolution as a web of chances, 1,000 paths crossing in the dark. Limbs, lungs, eyes, and necks didn't evolve toward land, they evolved within the water, and only later, when the world changed, did they prove useful beyond it. Evolution, like an artist, repurposed its materials. The same brushstrokes that painted the swamp also painted the forest. There's a kind of quiet humor in that. The limbs that once braced against riverbanks would, millions of years later, grasp branches, cradle young, hold tools. The neck that turned toward flickering prey beneath reeds would someday turn toward the stars. Every human gesture, every step, every glance, every lift of the arm carries within it the ghost of an ancient swimmer pressing against a root. But at the time it was simply practicality. Life adapts to what it knows, not to what's coming. When the shallow waters warmed, these creatures didn't decide to leave. They just followed their instincts to find food, to stay safe, to breathe where they could. In doing so, they stumbled into a world of new possibilities. What worked in the swamp also worked on the shore, just enough to survive, just enough to persist. The bones tell this story beautifully. When paleontologists study the early tetrapods, they find the subtle fingerprints of water still etched into every structure. The humerus, the upper limb bone, shows evidence of muscles once used for pushing, not walking. The joint surfaces, smooth and curved, reveal movements made for sweeping arcs, through liquid, not strides across solid ground. Even the vertebrae carry traces of a life supported by buoyancy, not burdened by gravity. And yet, each of those features became the foundation of terrestrial anatomy. It's a reminder that life never begins from scratch. Nature is a recycler, a minimalist, a patient improviser. Evolution doesn't build new tools for every challenge. It reuses the old ones, reshapes them, stretches them into new contexts. What begins as a paddle may become a leg. What begins as a fin tray may become a finger. What begins as adaptation becomes exaptation. And that is where creativity hides. The philosopher of biology Stephen Jay Gould once described exaptation as the happy accident of history. It's the reason birds have feathers, not because they first needed to fly, but because those feathers evolved for warmth, for display, for balance. Only later did they catch the wind. The same principle applies to our own lineage. The first steps toward land weren't planned rehearsals for walking, but the byproduct of adaptations that happened to fit a new purpose when the time came. And so the story of exaptation is not one of foresight, but of flexibility. It's about how life thrives by being open to coincidence. When environments shift, as they always do, some traits suddenly reveal hidden potential. The world asks new questions, and old solutions answer in surprising ways. The fish that once steadied itself in a current can now stand. The creature that once turned its neck to look sideways can now gaze upward. The muscles that once pressed water aside can now press against earth. Evolution doesn't celebrate these transitions. It barely notices them. But the earth does. The earth watches patiently as its children discover new ways to belong. Imagine the Devonian twilight, the surface of the water still and gold, the air heavy with scent. A creature rises from the shallows, its body slick with light. It lifts itself for a moment, head turning, eyes catching the reflection of trees swaying above. It doesn't know it's doing anything historic. It's just following a flicker, a sound, a movement, a whisper of possibility. Its limbs, born for another purpose, hold. Its breath steadies, and the planet, amused and gentle, seems to murmur, "Ah, that works too." That's exaptation, evolution's shrug and smile. It's how the accidental becomes the essential, how the limb that once swam becomes the arm that builds, the hand that writes, the wing that flies. It's the reason our skeletons still carry the shape of water, even as we walk beneath the sky. There's a humility in that realization. For all our pride in being land dwellers, the truth is that our very ability to stand, to turn, to reach, was borrowed from ancestors who never intended to do any of those things. We are built upon repurposed grace, the echoes of swimmers who found themselves briefly on shore, Evolution didn't make a plan for us. It just allowed the accidents to happen, and we are what survived. If you trace your fingers along your own arm, from shoulder to wrist, from wrist to fingertip, you are tracing a lineage of accidents. The bones that move beneath your skin were once tools for another world, shaped by the resistance of water, the rhythm of currents, the movement of your neck, the tilt of your head, the rise of your chest, all echoes of an ancient choreography first performed in the mud of shallow rivers. And if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear it. The faint murmur of an ancient sea, the whisper of roots brushing against fins, the sigh of water over stone. Evolution doesn't speak in straight lines. It hums in circles, in repurposed melodies, in old songs sung with new meaning. So, when we speak of exaptation, we are really speaking of that song, the one the Earth has been singing since the first cell divided. It's a song about adaptation, yes, but also about serendipity, about the way life stumbles into brilliance, about the way chaos and chance become design without intention. In the end, the dry land that would one day host forests, mountains, and cities was claimed not by ambition but by accident, by creatures whose bodies were shaped for water and just happened, to work on land. The Earth, amused as ever, let it happen, and from that quiet coincidence, every step, every breath, every heartbeat on land began. Exaptation, the happy accident of evolution. The moment when the universe winks, and what once was made for one world becomes perfect for another. If you listen to the heartbeat of the Earth long enough, you begin to understand something both humbling and beautiful. Nature doesn't plan, it improvises. It does not move toward a grand design or follow a cosmic blueprint. It simply happens, through endless experiments, through tiny adjustments, through the chaos of chance. Every bone, every breath, every flick of a fin or beat of a wing is the product of accidents that happen to work. Evolution, for all its power, is not a story of intention. It is a story of persistence, of the universe rolling its dice again and again, until something breathes. For most of its history, life didn't know where it was going. It still doesn't. When the first creatures crept from the shallows, they weren't chasing destiny, they were chasing survival. The water around them warmed, thickened, changed. The air above shimmered with new possibilities, and by some coincidence of anatomy and circumstance, a few of those creatures found themselves able to live just barely outside their birthplace. The rest is a long, meandering improvisation that led, eventually, to us. But that journey wasn't guided by foresight. It was sculpted by mistakes that proved useful, by traits borrowed from one world and repurposed in another. The limbs that pushed through reeds in ancient rivers became legs that strode across continents. The lungs that gulped air from stagnant water became the engines of song and speech. The eyes that watched through green shallows began to look upward, at stars. It feels like a plan only because we arrived at the end of it. But there was never a map. Imagine, instead, a dice table, the size of a planet. Each roll a mutation, each toss a small change in bone, breath, or instinct. Millions of years of chance, colliding and combining, until something unexpected thrives. That's evolution's language. Probability whispered in protein, chance etched in calcium. It's not perfection that drives it forward, but survivability. The good enough, not the grand, is what endures. And sometimes the good enough becomes extraordinary. When the first tetrapods, those early four-limbed creatures, emerged, they didn't step into a new world with purpose. They stumbled into it. Their bodies, shaped for shallow water, happened to function on land. They were not designed for the shore any more than a fish today is designed for the sky. Yet they moved, awkward and slow, and somehow it worked. The world rewarded the accident. Gravity didn't crush them. Their lungs managed to draw air. Their skin, though fragile, held. In that clumsy intersection of chance and environment, a new chapter began. It's tempting to see that as progress, as if evolution wanted to reach land, to reach us. But progress is a word humans invented. Nature doesn't recognize it. The amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, and people who followed are all children of the same happy mishap. The Earth simply tested one possibility, found that it survived, and let time take care of the rest. Every success of the tetrapods, from the croak of the frog to the thunder of the sauropod to the whisper of human breath, is written in the same accidental ink. We owe our existence to traits that were never meant for us, limbs that were built to paddle, lungs that were meant to sip air above still ponds, spines that evolved to twist in water, all of it borrowed, repurposed, adapted. We are, in the grandest sense, an unintended consequence. That is evolution's quiet lesson, that wonder can emerge from randomness. Consider the modern lungfish, a living ghost of our ancient lineage. It spends most of its life underwater, breathing through gills, but when its pond dries, it wriggles into the mud, gulps air with primitive lungs, and waits. If you watch closely, you'll see it move, pushing itself across the damp ground with fins that act almost like hands. To an observer, it looks like evolution happening in real time, but the lungfish isn't trying to walk. It isn't seeking land. It's just trying to survive. It crawls not toward the future, but toward water, to the next pool, the next chance to breathe. That simple act, that desperate crawl, is the same story our ancestors lived hundreds of millions of years ago. They didn't intend to become pioneers of dry land. They were lungfish with luck, caught between drought and flood, learning step by accidental step how to use what they already had. Their limbs were not tools of ambition. They were instruments of endurance. The same resilience that lets the modern lungfish find a new puddle carried our ancestors into an entirely new world, not by vision but by necessity. And that's the paradox that defines evolution. It builds the future without knowing it. It creates by trial, not by intention. The adaptations that change the world rarely appear because they're needed for the future. They appear because they work now. The Earth doesn't think ahead. It just changes the conditions and waits to see what survives. When we look back at this history, it's easy to fall into the trap of purpose, to believe that life was always meant to reach this point, that tetrapods succeeded because they were meant to. But success in the biological sense is only survival multiplied over time. Frogs and lizards, birds and humans, all are successes only because their bodies happen to fit their environments. There's no hierarchy, no plan, just an endless conversation between chance and circumstance. Even the mightiest creatures, like the dinosaurs, were not the goal of evolution. They were its momentary expression. Their rise and fall, like ours, was governed by the same roll of dice: asteroid, climate, luck. Evolution doesn't mourn and it doesn't celebrate. It simply starts again, reusing what remains. And yet, there is poetry in this indifference. It means that life is resilient not because it is planned, but because it is flexible. Every accident, every misstep, every mutation holds the potential for something new. The universe is full of such quiet improvisations. Feathers evolved for warmth, later catching the wind. Eyes evolved for the shallow sea, later gazing at the stars. Fins evolved for swimming, later pressing into soil. To say evolution has no plan is not to say it lacks beauty. In fact, it makes it more miraculous, for out of blind experimentation has come the intricate architecture of life, the veins of a leaf, the wings of a dragonfly, the heartbeat of a mammal. Each is an echo of chaos organized by time. Each is an answer to a question no one asked. Perhaps that's what makes the story of the tetrapods so deeply human. They didn't march onto land as heroes of progress. They slipped onto it by accident and made do. They took a wrong turn and found an entire world waiting. Every evolutionary line since, from frogs to elephants, from dinosaurs to us, has been built on that same foundation of coincidence. We are the beneficiaries of happenstance, the descendants of creatures that adapted not out of foresight, but out of stubbornness. Think of it, the bones in your arms and legs, the breath that fills your lungs, the way your head turns when you hear your name, all of it born from accidents in water. We live surrounded by these echoes of the swamp. The architecture of our skeletons still remembers the resistance of currents. The rhythm of our hearts still beats to an ancient aquatic tempo. Even our movements, graceful or clumsy, carry the ghost of the old push against the riverbed. When you walk, you're repeating the experiment of your ancestors. A series of adjustments that once served to paddle through reeds, now repurposed for crossing continents. Every step you take is a small tribute to the improvisations of evolution, to the creatures who never knew what they were beginning. The modern lungfish, tucked into its muddy refuge, is the reminder that evolution doesn't erase its past. The same ancient strategy that allowed it to survive droughts 400 million years ago still works. It doesn't care that we call it primitive. It simply endures. It moves through the world not with purpose but with patience. Like evolution itself, it trusts that chance will be enough. So what do we learn from this? Perhaps that the universe doesn't need intent to create brilliance. That meaning can arise without direction. That beauty can emerge from randomness. The tetrapods didn't become great because evolution chose them. They became many because they endured. They used the tools the water gave them, and those tools happened to work on land. And maybe that's the quiet wisdom in all of it. Survival isn't about having a plan. It's about being ready for coincidence. Evolution rewards adaptability, not ambition. Life doesn't dream of possibilities, it simply discovers them by living long enough to notice. When you think of that first creature, half fish, half something else, lifting its head above the water, imagine it not as a triumph but as an accident. A single motion, unremarkable, repeated until it became habit. A habit that became anatomy, an anatomy that became legacy. And out of that legacy came everything that walks, crawls, and breathes on land today. The earth, watching patiently, must have smiled. See, it might have whispered. No plan at all, just persistence. So, when we ask ourselves what evolution means, perhaps the answer is simpler than we think. It means that life is what happens when chemistry refuses to give up. It means that accidents, given enough time, can build galaxies of meaning. It means that you, me, the frog on the bank, and the lungfish in its muddy den are all part of the same unplanned experiment, still unfolding, still adapting, still rolling the dice. The next time you walk near water, pause for a moment. Listen. Beneath the ripples, beneath the hum of the present, the old voice of the earth still murmurs. The same voice that once whispered to the fish in the shallows. Try again. See where it leads. And through that single patient whisper, life continues. Look around you for a moment, at the soft rhythm of your own breathing. The cat sleeping in a curl of sunlight. The dog stretching, tail flicking, paws pressing against the floor. The frog hidden in a damp corner of the garden, its throat pulsing in steady time. Every living, breathing tetrapod, every creature that walks, hops, or soars, carries the same ancient signature in its bones. A pattern first drawn in mud 500 million years ago by an accident. That single moment in the Devonian when a fish pressed its fins into the shallows and felt the resistance of the earth still echoes in every limb on land today. It wasn't a heroic act, not a leap toward destiny, but a small instinctive gesture, an experiment, a movement through water that by some coincidence happened to work on land. And from that improvisation, that blind, beautiful mistake, every land-dwelling creature was born. When we stretch an arm, when a bird folds its wing, when a lizard scurries or a frog leaps, the motion is the same ancient choreography, the rhythm of the first tetrapod limbs, repurposed and refined. The humerus, radius, ulna, those same bones from that same fish, have been replayed across the ages, reshaped into instruments of walking, flying, swimming, grasping. Evolution doesn't compose new music, it remixes the old. Every tetrapod body is a variation on a Devonian theme, from amphibians crouched beside ponds to the heron poised above them, from whales returning to the sea to humans building cities beside it. All of us are heirs to that accident. Life didn't know where it was going when it crawled out of the water. It still does, but it keeps trying, adjusting, exploring, adapting. The earth keeps whispering, continue. That's what evolution is, not progress, but persistence. Not design, but iteration. It's the world forever running experiments, keeping the ones that work for now, discarding the rest without regret. Intelligence, beauty, speed, none were planned. They emerged like waves on the surface of time, rising and falling, each one shaped by circumstance. The frog's leap, the dog's bark, the human's thought, all are echoes of chance meeting opportunity. Even our minds, that restless machinery of curiosity and reflection, are products of accidents that just happened to align. The neurons firing, the opposable thumb, the social spark, each arose from small changes that solved immediate problems: how to grasp, how to cooperate, how to remember. None of them were meant to lead to philosophy or poetry. Yet here we are, sitting under electric lights, telling stories about ancient fish. Evolution, it seems, has a sense of humour. And yet, there is a kind of profound hope in that humour. Because if complexity, consciousness, and compassion can arise from such unguided experiments, then the universe is richer than intention. It means that even without purpose, life finds meaning, that beauty does not need design to exist. When we look across the living world today, the frog clinging to a reed, the hawk gliding on thermals, the dolphin twisting beneath waves, we see the living legacy of that ancient accident. The forms are different, but the foundation is shared. 4 limbs, a backbone, a skull, a pair of lungs, the same architecture reused over and over with exquisite creativity. Evolution is a sculptor who never begins anew. It simply reshapes what remains. And so the story of the Devonian accident is not a tale of triumph, but of continuity. Life didn't conquer the land, it adapted to it. It didn't seize its destiny, it stumbled into it again and again, and each stumble led somewhere new, from the forests of amphibians to the plains of dinosaurs, from the first mammals scurrying in shadows to the primates swinging through canopies. Every success was provisional, every form temporary. Even we, architects of cities, storytellers of origins, are just another experiment. One more variation in the long improvisation of life. Perhaps that's what makes this legacy so beautiful. It reminds us that we belong to something larger than intention. The same randomness that built us also built the ecosystems we depend on. The air we breathe is the exhalation of plants whose ancestors found their own accidents in sunlight. The soil beneath our feet is the dust of ancient forests that once rose because of chance mutations in root and leaf. The world around us is not planned. It's composed note by the hand of coincidence. And now we are its caretakers, the living products of chance, holding in our hands the future of that same process. Every forest, every coral reef, every river delta is a continuation of the same evolutionary experiment, a system balancing between chaos and order, diversity and decline. To protect these ecosystems is not just to preserve beauty, but to honor the improbable chain of accidents that made them. Think of it. A Devonian fish's fin becomes a lizard's leg. That leg becomes a wolf's paw. That paw becomes the hand that plants a tree. The loop closes. The earth experiments. And one of its creations learns to protect the rest. Evolution doesn't have foresight, but we do. And with that gift comes responsibility. If evolution is a dice game, then we are the first players aware of the table. We can see the stakes now: climate, habitat, extinction, and we can choose how to roll next. That doesn't make us masters of evolution, but participants in it. The same randomness that shaped our ancestors still shapes us. But now, we can guide its outcomes in small, deliberate ways. We can choose preservation over neglect, balance over excess. And in doing so, we keep the experiment alive. Every creature alive today, from the smallest newt to the largest elephant, is a survivor of that ancient roll of the dice. Each carries forward the results of countless tries, countless failures. Evolution thrives not because it always wins, but because it never stops playing. When one form falters, another emerges. When one path ends, another opens. The resilience of life is not found in perfection, but in endless variation. When we protect biodiversity, we protect that capacity for variation, the ability of life to keep inventing itself. Every species, no matter how obscure, is another note in the Earth's long improvisation. The loss of even one is a silence that echoes across the whole song. So what can we do, knowing that our world is the child of such a happy accident? Perhaps the lesson is not to impose order, but to preserve possibility, to keep the waters clear, the forests breathing, the soils alive, to ensure that evolution's dice can still roll freely, that life can continue to test, to change, to surprise. In that way, conservation is not just protection, is participation. It is the recognition that we are not separate from this great process, but woven into it. The frogs that sing at night, the birds that trace spirals in the sky, the dogs that run beside us, all of them share the same ancestral melody. When we defend their habitats, we are defending our shared origin, our shared accident. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, you can almost feel that continuity, the pulse of your blood, the rhythm of your breathing, the way your body settles into gravity, all ancient, all borrowed from the creatures that came before. The earth hums softly beneath you, the same planet that once watched fish breathe air for the first time. And if you listen closely, you might hear the old whisper, the same one that has guided life for billions of years. Continue. Continue experimenting. Continue adapting. Continue caring. From the frogs in the rainforest to the sparrows in the cities, from wolves in the tundra to humans staring at glowing screens, all are threads in the same evolving web. We are not the end of evolution's story, but a fleeting sentence in its infinite poem. The best we can do is make that sentence meaningful by nurturing the world that birthed us. So when you walk through a park or a forest, pause for a moment, touch the bark of a tree, feel the breath of wind that has traveled across oceans. Watch the way a bird lifts from the ground, the way its wings fold in midair, that motion, that structure, that elegance, all of it born from the same Devonian accident that gave you your arms. You are looking at your reflection, written in another form. We are all descendants of that first movement through mud, not a plan, not a prophecy, but an act of persistence. The Devonian fish didn't know what it was starting. It simply lived, and in doing so left us this inheritance of motion, of breath, of possibility. Now it is our turn to continue the experiment, not by dominating it, but by protecting its diversity. Because the greatest miracle of evolution is not that it made us intelligent, but that it made a world that still has room for everything else. The earth, patient as always, seems to murmur beneath our feet. Keep going, keep creating. The accident was never over, it only changed its form. Some creatures carry time within them. You can see it in their eyes, slow, patient, untroubled by the hurry of modern life. They are not relics, though people often call them that. They are continuations, echoes of a world long gone, still breathing beside us. In the hush between centuries they have persisted, unchanged in form, but rich in endurance. Biologists call them living fossils. Poets might call them memory made flesh. The earth, if it could speak, might simply murmur, "Remember me." Among these keepers of ancient memory, none are more eloquent than the lungfish. To look at one is to peer directly into the Devonian, the age of fishes when continents were still wild experiments, and the line between land and sea blurred beneath tangled forests of algae and ferns. The lungfish has remained almost the same for more than 400 million years. Its body, long and supple, is armored with soft scales. Its mouth opens with an almost human sigh. It has gills like any fish, but it also has lungs, true lungs, twin sacs that fill with air drawn from above the water's surface. In Australia, South America, and Africa, the lungfish still lives as though the Devonian never ended. In the muddy backwaters of Queensland, one can see the Australian lungfish drifting lazily between tree roots, its fins moving with a slow, rhythmic grace. It breathes with quiet bubbles, unhurried, as if aware that it has already survived eons of change. When the rivers dry, it burrows into damp soil, encased in a cocoon of mucus, waiting for the rains to return. The African lungfish, its cousin, is more dramatic. It can survive for years in suspended animation, curled beneath the earth, heart beating once every few minutes. It does not panic. It endures. Watching a lungfish is like meeting a ghost that never died. The shape of its body is the shape of our ancestry. Inside its fins lie the same bones that one day became the arms of amphibians, the wings of birds, the hands that write, build, and reach. The Devonian still flickers beneath its skin, and with each slow movement, it reminds us of what it means to survive without needing to change. But the lungfish is not alone in this quiet fraternity of timekeepers. Across the continents, there are others, survivors that have outlasted empires, ice ages, and extinctions. The ginkgo tree, for instance, once spread across the world's forests, it now stands mostly in parks and temple courtyards, its fan-shaped leaves trembling in the wind. It has watched the rise and fall of mountains, the drift of continents, the coming and going of species. Its lineage dates back more than 270 million years older than flowers, older than dinosaurs. When autumn comes, its leaves turn a luminous gold, and for a moment it seems to hold the sun itself in its branches. And then there is the horseshoe crab, another ancient witness, another soft-spoken miracle. Its shell, shaped like a crescent moon, gleams bronze beneath the tides. Its blue blood, rich in copper, still flows through a design that has remained untouched for nearly 500 million years. Before trees, before wings, before vertebrates ever dreamed of land, the horseshoe crab was already here, moving across the sea floor on its many legs. It has survived all 5 great mass extinctions, its only armor patience and adaptation. Even now it returns to the same beaches its ancestors knew, laying eggs beneath the moonlight, as if the world had never changed. To stand before these creatures is to stand in the presence of time itself, not the ticking kind, but the deep geologic time that flows beneath all things. They are reminders that evolution is not a ladder of progress, but a river of persistence. Some branches rush forward, diversifying, changing, exploring new worlds. Others, like the lungfish and the ginkgo, find stillness, a perfect balance, and stay, not because they failed to evolve, but because they found no reason to. In a way, these living fossils are humbling teachers. They show us that survival doesn't always mean transformation. Sometimes endurance is enough. The world shifts, climates cool and warm, continents drift apart, and yet, somewhere, quietly, the same bodies continue. Their success is not in their novelty, but in their constancy. The earth changes around them, and they change just enough to stay. When you look at a lungfish's slow blink, a ginkgo's leaves turning in the autumn wind, or a horseshoe crab's ancient crawl under moonlight, you're seeing not just the persistence of life, but the persistence of chance, of accidents that worked so well they never needed revision. They are the living punctuation marks in the long sentence of evolution, pauses that remind us how far the story stretches. And yet, despite their resilience, they are fragile now, as all old things are. The world that once nourished them has grown louder, faster, hotter. The swamps that cradle the lungfish dry sooner each year. The coastal sands that cradle the horseshoe crab are invaded by light and noise. Even the ginkgo, stalwart and serene, depends more and more on the care of human hands. These creatures may have survived millions of years of natural upheaval, but they are not prepared for us, for the speed of our changes, for the narrowing of the spaces they call home. That's why their preservation is not just scientific, it's moral. To protect these species is to protect continuity itself, to keep open the thread that links us to the Devonian. When we save the lungfish, we are saving the first chapter of our own story. When we guard the ginkgo grove or the tidal flat, we are keeping alive a line of memory older than mammals, older than leaves shaped like ours. So perhaps, as you listen to this quiet journey through deep time, take a moment to imagine those survivors not as relics, but as witnesses. The lungfish drifting in its slow dream beneath the water's surface, the ginkgo's leaves rustling like paper pages in the wind, the horseshoe crab pulling itself through the sand, each step a repetition of one it has taken for 500 million years. They are still here, the Devonian, Carboniferous, and Jurassic all folded into one present moment, breathing beside us. If you'd like to travel further into their world, we invite you to join us for our special episode on living fossils, where we'll explore these ancient lineages in detail, from the marshes of Australia to the shores of Delaware Bay, where the moon pulls the horseshoe crabs to gather, as it has for countless centuries. It's an episode devoted to the quiet endurance of life itself, the proof that evolution's story isn't only about change, but about the persistence of forms that time could not erase. And if you believe, as we do, that these stories matter, that the whispers of ancient life deserve to be heard, consider helping us continue to tell them. Support public broadcasting, like PBS, whose gentle patience mirrors the patience of the earth. It is through these spaces of curiosity and calm that science remains a conversation, not a lecture, a candle passed from one generation to the next. And to those who sustain this series through Patreon, thank you. Your support keeps these stories alive, allows us to wander further into the quiet corners of time, and to bring back the wonder we find there. It's a kind of modern symbiosis, patrons and storytellers, much like coral and algae, co-creating something luminous in exchange for care. When this episode ends, when the sound fades, I hope you carry with you the image of the lungfish resting in its pool, of the ginkgo's golden leaves falling like soft memories to the ground, of the horseshoe crab tracing its ancient path beneath the moon. Each is a reminder that the past never truly disappears. It lives alongside us, breathing through the present, asking only that we remember. The earth, after all, does not forget its own experiments. Some remain in stone, others remain alive, and every so often, if you look closely, you can see the Devonian still shimmering. Not in museums or textbooks, but in the slow movement of a fish that refuses to vanish, in the green fan of a leaf that outlived empires, in the glint of a shell that predates bones. These are not just survivors, they are the living pulse of deep time, a soft, steady beat that has never stopped. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of the modern world, you might hear the earth whispering through them, through all of us. Remember me. I'm still here. And now, as the tide of this story drifts towards stillness, let us return one last time to the beginning, to that small, glistening creature in the Devonian dusk, a lungfish pressing its fins into the mud. It is not seeking greatness or destiny. It is simply trying to live. The air is heavy, the pool is shrinking, and somewhere beyond the reeds, a quiet accident begins. From that slow, uncertain crawl came everything that would one day move across the land. The world unfolded through chance, through the clumsy persistence of life. The lungfish that gasped became the ancestors of creatures with limbs and lungs, the first wanderers between two elements, and through them, in ways no plan could predict, the tetrapods inherited the earth. Frogs, lizards, birds, wolves, humans, all children of that muddy experiment. The fossils, remember. In the stone bones of Tiktaalik, we find the first hint of a neck turning toward the sun. In Acanthostega, we see limbs that stirred water but dreamed of steadier ground. Each discovery is a whisper from time, a reminder that curiosity never truly dies. Even stone, it seems, still wants to speak. And that is what makes this story so endlessly tender, that we are not separate from it. We are its continuation. Our bodies still echo those ancient swimmers. Every breath you take, every step you make, carries the rhythm of the Devonian tide. Life in all its forms is the earth's longest song, and it began as a murmur in the shallows. So as you listen now, wherever you are, lying on a warm bed, curled on a couch, or gazing out at the night sky, imagine the ancient swamp beneath the stars. The air glows faintly green with mist. In the distance, small creatures ripple the surface, fins brushing against starlight, reflected in the water. The world is quiet, patient, alive. The same patience that shaped that first breath shapes us still. The same curiosity that pulled those early creatures from the shallows pulls us now toward understanding, toward science, toward wonder. That's why stories like this one matter. They remind us how improbable, how fragile, how miraculous our existence truly is. If you found peace in this journey, consider supporting the spaces that make such reflection possible. PBS, calm, curious, open to discovery, continues the gentle tradition of listening to the Earth stories and sharing them with care. You can help keep that light alive so that the next curious listener somewhere out there may hear the whispers of ancient water and know they belong to it too. And to you, thank you for being here, for listening, for letting the past breathe again. Now, let the world grow quiet. The swamp shimmers in moonlight, the ripples slow, the air hums softly with the memory of the first breath. Somewhere, a lungfish turns in its sleep beneath the mud, and the earth, still whispering after all these ages, seems to sigh, "Rest now, the story continues. Good night, traveller of time. May your dreams be full of water and light, and the gentle rhythm of life crawling still toward tomorrow." And when you wake, share this wonder. Let others know that the earth remembers, and that we too are part of its song.